The commander of Russian forces in Ukraine says the situation in the southern city of Kherson is difficult and residents are being evacuated. Kherson was the first big city to fall to the Russians back in February. Ukrainian forces have been steadily retaking nearby territory for the past few weeks. They've pushed as far as 30 kilometers south of the Dnipro River, threatening to trap Russian troops. Arise News chief correspondent John Cookson has this report.
We have to rely on Russian television for images of what's happening on the ground in occupied Kherson. But this broadcast appears to show families being evacuated to the east side of the Dnipro River, away from the new expected battlefront. The Russian-installed governor, Vladimir Saldo, says it's necessary to evacuate so the military can do their job and not have to think about civilians. It's to enable the military to do their job efficiently and with fewer losses for the civilian population, he said. And Putin's recently installed commander of Russian forces in Ukraine, General Surovikin, described the situation in the southern region and city of Kherson as very difficult. Surovikin also alleged that Ukraine was planning to attack infrastructure in the region, including a dam at a hydroelectric plant. This week, Ukraine has been hit by swarms of Iranian-supplied Russian drones, taking out apartment blocks and water and power plants as Putin's tactics develop. All we can say for sure is there's no end in sight, and civilians are as much on the front line as soldiers are in the battlegrounds. John Cookson, Arise News.
And John now joins us from London, where he's monitoring developments. Good day to you, John, and give us an update on what's happening in Kherson.
Well, that evacuation, which started this morning, is still underway. Kherson city itself, a city of around 300,000 people in normal times. Since the war began, that's shrunk down to 150,000, and the authorities there in occupied Kherson city and also part of the Kherson region say that this evacuation will continue for the next 6 days to get around 60,000 people to safety, because all the indications are that the Ukrainians are planning a major assault to retake territory that the Russians seized and indeed declared part of Russia as part of their annexation program last month. So a serious situation for the civilians. It looks from the images as if there's no panic and they seem to be calm. But just bear in mind that those images that we get from that region are conducted under the watch of Russian imposed monitors who will decide what images are released to the outside world. And a little later on today, I'll be using interviews from the people of Kherson, who seem, on the face of it, happy to be evacuated. And on the one hand, it is a good sign that the Russians are getting the civilians out of their homes and away from the potential danger zone. But they did exactly the same earlier this year in Mariupol in May. And some of those people have never been seen again. And the Ukrainians claim that they were forcibly shipped to Russia. And indeed, the lower house of the Russian parliament, the Duma, discussed getting citizens from Kherson into Russia properly and away from their homes. Now, if people are forcibly removed from their homes, and we have no proof that they are at the moment, if they are, then that would amount to a war crime under United Nations regulations. So a very sensitive situation at the moment in Kherson. On the face of it, civilians being evacuated to safety ahead of a big push, an expected big push by the Ukrainians to try and seize as much territory as they can before the winter comes. But on the other hand, there has to be great concern about what is actually happening to those civilians that we saw in my report, and indeed that tens of thousands more who are waiting to be evacuated from that region.
Very well said, John. Now, President Putin recently put a new general in charge of Ukraine operations. What tactical changes can we see already?
This is General Kherson. He is a former special forces fighter in Afghanistan. He's 56 years old. And the KGB agents from Putin's era, and of course Putin was in the KGB, had a great mistrust of the Russian army, the question about their loyalty to the regime in the Kremlin. But this man is from the Air Force. He has a fearsome reputation. He's known among colleagues as General Armageddon. Now, the reason why he's known as General Armageddon is that he was behind some of the fiercest bombing of civilian areas in Syria and also in Chechnya in the Second Chechen War. And we can see already his influence in the last week of more missile and drone attacks from the air, of course, in Ukraine, taking out apartment blocks, power plants, and water plants. So we can see already, and you saw from his demeanor in my report, the kind of bluff, gruff military man that he is. And he's in charge now and being tasked with turning around Putin's defeats on the battlefield against the Ukrainians.
Now, in light of this development, John, do we expect a continuation of the drone strikes? We've already seen how deadly they've been this week.
Very much so. I think the Russians can see that they've had a certain amount of success with these drone and cruise missile attacks on urban areas. They believe that they're having an impact on the morale of the people, and that, of course, is the aim. There's no great military advantage in using drones, but it's to terrorize, to frighten the Ukrainian population in general and turn them against, in theory, turn them against the regime in Kiev. Now, when Adolf Hitler did the same sort of thing back at the end of the Second World War with his doodlebugs, his V-1 rockets that were fired from Germany towards the UK, with no specific target, they hit civilian areas and killed quite a lot of people at the time. But they had the opposite effect of hitting morale. In fact, the British people rallied even more behind the government of Winston Churchill, and it's interesting that Putin perhaps hasn't learned from that experience.
And indeed, it doesn't appear as though he's learnt at all. Well, thank you so much, Arise Chief Correspondent John Cookson. We appreciate your time and analysis as always.